So, as the NAR settlement and all that kind of stuff. So originally, C.A.R came out with some draft form updates that we went through before a month or maybe 2 months ago, and then some of those forms that they originally had in draft version have changed, and the listing agreement changed. It's really only a couple of things that changed, but it's a big change that happened. And then those forms, the listing agreement and the buyer broker agreement from C.A.R have actually been released. So they're the live versions. If you go to take a listing or do a buyer broker agreement, they're the only option that you have right now is the new form that we're going to go over today. The buyer representation agreement is going to look very, very similar. Not a lot of changes to that. The listing agreement, like I said, does have a couple significant changes that we'll go through. So, the bottom line is, as this unfolds, there could be even more changes down the road for all we know, but at least at this point, we do have some concrete documents to work with. Another thing to note, Daniel and I took some more classes here recently regarding these particular final updates to the forms. And one of the things is that the NAR settlement drop dead date for making changes to our industry is August the 17th. But some of the fields, it's up to the individual MLSs when they're going to delete the CBB field, the commission field. And so we did reach out to SD MLS, and they said that they're going to leave the let's see here, for the CMLS, they're going to leave it until August the 1st, I believe.
It's August 5th for Connect MLS and August 12th for Paragon.
Oh, thank you. Yep, that's what I was looking. So August the 5th and August the 12th. So as of now, like today through basically, if you're in San Diego, there's really not a whole lot that you need to do. Obviously, I don't think anybody has any active clients now except for me in terms of like an actual listing. So we won't have to go into too much detail, but we'll keep you posted on the dates for various things. So really those dates that we just talked about for the MLS were more important for current listings because those might need to be modified. The listing agreement might need to be modified a little bit. So you guys don't really have to worry about that because you don't have any active listings at this point. So I won't bore you with that detail. And then I'll go ahead and share the screen, and then I'll review the residential listing agreement. Can you guys see that screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, I'm going to move this over here. So it obviously has the agency disclosure up front, like always. So I just went ahead and kind of filled out a few things in this one. All this top part is the same. The listing period, the same. They didn't change anything there versus what we already talked about. The maximum listing for the maximum time frame for a listing is 2 years, 24 months. Then when we get down to part C, we talked about this before. They have a big blurb about commission rates are not fixed by law. That's not different. This part, though, C1, 2, 3, and 4, this is going to be a little different than the options that they had for the draft version. The first part is the same. So commission to seller's broker. So this is only the seller side of the transaction. So if you were taking a listing, let's say if Marilyn was taking a listing and she met with the seller, this is the amount that Marilyn would expect to receive for her services. It has nothing to do with the total commission that a seller might pay. For C is any additional compensation to the seller's broker if the buyer is unrepresented. So remember, this is different than a dual agency. This is if let's say Maryland has a listing and she has this listing agreement filled out, and she receives an unsolicited offer, basically, from an investor client who says, you know, I don't have an agent, I don't want an agent, I want you to present this offer to the seller. Well, we have to present the offer to the seller, of course, because we're trying to facilitate the sale for the seller. And if the seller wants us as the listing agent to work with this buyer, even though they're unrepresented, basically it was the advice of the C.A.R attorneys that we should go ahead and work with that seller or that buyer. Even though we're not representing them, we should still be we should still proceed. If the seller wants to accept the offer, we basically have to facilitate that sale. So in other words, you might as well get paid in this scenario if you're taking the extra liability and effort, because, you know, someone's still going to need to meet them for or schedule access for home inspections. You're going to, you know, get more questions. Now, obviously, one of the big things they tried to drive home was, even if you have the non-agency agreement, you still need to make sure that throughout the transaction, you're reminding the buyer that they chose to be unrepresented, that anything that you say is solely on behalf of the interest of the seller. But all of that's going to be extra effort and work on your part. So in my mind, if I were taking a listing, I would never leave this field blank. I would put something in there, whatever it is you want to put in there. There's no fixed amount, of course. This is just an example, but I would put something in there, because you're not really going to be able, if the seller wants you to work with that unrepresented buyer, we aren't as a brokerage going to be able to say, no, I just don't feel comfortable working with this investor. If we've signed up to sell this house for the seller and the seller likes their offer, we can't force the buyer to have an agent. So does that make sense? Okay. All right.
Yes.
And then there's a continuation of rights for compensation. This was already in the original draft version. It's also something that's in the current listing. So this is for if you have prospective buyers that were identified during your listing period, but your listing expired, then you had some extra time period in there. That would be the number of days that you could still potentially earn the commission. And then the last part that they have is seller obligation to pay previous brokers. So this is something that we want to always ask a seller to make sure that they haven't signed a listing agreement with somebody else before. And if so, are there any specific buyers that they would owe a commission to if that buyer were to purchase? You'll need to know that up front. Again, that's not any different than what has kind of already been in our contracts. What you will notice, though, is that there is no option for the seller to direct you, to authorize you to have any sort of offer of cooperating compensation to the buyer's agent. They reiterated several times in my training class that scenario, although they don't think it's illegal, obviously we've done that historically for years, although they still think it's perfectly legal, their quote was, CAR forms do not support that option. If you want to do that, if your seller directs you to do that, you'll need to document that on your own, however you want to document it, based on conversations with your broker. So we can come back to that a little bit later. Daniel, do you want to add anything to that from your training class, or just other thoughts you had?
Yeah, so I don't know if Troy, you're going to get to the MLSA form, but there is a box to check on a separate form now that says the seller authorizes you to basically disclose the willingness of the seller to pay compensation. But even that, it's not like a blank, a field where you can say, and that amount is this much percentage wise. And I know Troy and I were talking about, how to do that if we wanted to. And I think Troy's gonna reach out to the real estate attorney just to get input. The only way that I could see it, but obviously Troy's the broker, so you'd have to decide this, would be as if you did like an addendum to this listing agreement. If you wanted to document, if your seller really said, no, I want to pay 3% to the buyer's agent, because there's nothing wrong with if a buyer's agent calls you and says, are they offering, you can say yes or no if the seller has told you that. But in terms of like our kind of protection, there's no real easy or just clear way to document it. And I think part of that goes back to the reason being is because ultimately it's just sort of it's a talking point, and what's really agreed upon is going to be what's agreed upon in the purchase side. So when there's an agreement with the buyer and seller, and obviously we'll get to that part, but that would be where there's an actual written, percentage or dollar amount that the seller is paying or not.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that too. It was very clear in this final class that I had just last week with the C.A.R attorney that basically C.A.R is really trying to say that the industry is and their forms are basically designed for the seller to negotiate the seller's commission and the buyer to negotiate the buyer's commission. And some of the words that that she used were that it was a splitting up, basically a complete splitting up, bifurcation, separation of commission. So that was the goal that they sort of wanted to have is, and that's kind of the direction that they see the industry going. We'll see how that plays out in reality, because we all know there's buyers who can't afford to pay the buyer's commission. But it does seem like they have taken a great leap toward having the industry be there. And then, so so we'll basically go over that, the mechanism for the buyer to get the seller to have the seller pay the compensation, but essentially the only way is for there's no longer going to be that the seller pays the broker a total amount and then the broker does compensation. It's pretty much always going to now be through the purchase agreement. Even if we were to have some sort of modification of terms where the seller said, yeah, I would like you to do it more where if buyer's agents call you, tell them I'm okay with 3% or whatever it is they do, and we document that somehow, it still needs to be in the purchase agreement. It's not going to flow through that the seller paid One Mission Realty 6% and then we paid the buyer's agent 3%. It's always going to be strictly through the purchase agreement from now on, essentially. I'll go
I
down
have a
here.
question.
Sure.
Um, what, first of all, Daniel, what form were you talking about? That there's a checkbox saying,
We'll go through it,
uh,
Kristen. Yeah.
oh, okay.
Mhm.
Well, so, but I also, my other question is, I mean, do we have to document in writing if we have a conversation with a seller that they're willing to offer something? Like, or can we just have that, in our back pocket anytime we're talking to pretend to, other agents that have buyers that want to show the property or whatever?
Right. So
Like, is
let's,
there a point in having it in writing anymore? Like, it seems like it's just a conversation you would have, like, hey, do you want to offer anything to, a buyer's agent?
right,
And if so, how much?
right.
And then we just know what that number is. We don't have it in writing or anything necessarily, right?
Yeah. So if there's a number, we definitely want to have it in writing because we don't want to be accused from the seller of making up a number. Plus, we need to be careful that we're not telling buyer agent A 1 percentage point and then number, and then buyer C's agent a different number, even if it was unintentional, if it kind of morphed over time. We need to have proof that whatever we were quoting was based on what the seller told us. But let me go through. So
It
this,
just seems silly to me that they would take that out of the contract if we need to have it in writing. You know what I mean? Like, why would you delete that completely if, we're now going to be like at risk for not having it in writing?
right. And I think it's honestly, I think it's because C.A.R was seeing the writing on the wall that there's a lot of other lawsuits out there, and that if that they needed to show that they were industry leaders in helping um, like I said, separate, bifurcate, split up the fact that historically sellers have determined what buyers agents get paid. They really want whoever they is, not necessarily C.A.R, but whoever's pushing all this litigation and changes, Department of Justice, all that, seem to really want the buyer to be responsible for determining the buyer's commission. Now, that doesn't mean, like we said, that it's illegal, but I think C.A.R doesn't want any part of directing us with those forms. So yes, your observation is correct. The liability is falling back to the brokerages rather than us having it, sweetly defined like the first draft versions were in the listing agreement. There's a reason they took it out. They don't say exactly why they did, other than they were just very clear on they wanted it to, the goal was to, change the industry. And they just reiterated that C.A.R forms don't currently support um, seller paid broker commission to the buyer's broker.
I think in practice, like kind of going to Kristen's point of like, why do we need to have it written down? I think it's just a matter of like what your conversation is with the buyer's agent. So
the seller's agent, you mean, or the buyer's agent?
The buyer's agent. So if you're the seller's agent and the buyer's agent calls you up and says, "Hey, I'm going to submit an offer. Are they willing to do a commission?" You could say, if your seller said, "Yeah, I'd be willing to do that," maybe you don't need that in writing. But you would want to go back to the fact of, yeah, I think they would probably be willing to do it, but obviously we need to see the terms, and we would negotiate those out in writing on the terms. So you just want to be very careful about what you're saying. And I think the reason being is because if you had a seller and you said, you agreed to 3% for your seller's commission, and you had a conversation with them, and maybe even in writing they said, yeah, I would like to do 3% to the buyer's agent, and then you have a buyer's agent that submits an offer, and let's say they submit it for 1.5%, and you've told other buyer's agents 3%, it could get it could create a bad situation. So I think it's just a matter of the conversation you're having with the buyer's agent is you don't want to be specific to say, yes, they will do 3% unless you absolutely know that.
Well, and there's another factor too. Let me go over this MLSA form. So this part I'm going to skip here because these are items included or excluded. We already know that. There's this part here, E, property will be marketed in the following MLS, and this is where we pick the MLS, and then there's a form which is automatically attached. So let's see here, that's in the contract. BCA form, there's that silly thing. Here it is. It was right there. Okay. So this is a form that we'll always have in there, and it's kind of explaining, what is an MLS, blah, blah, blah. All that makes sense. And so then this part down here, so the boilerplate part of this contract is going to say seller instructs broker to market the property to the public at the beginning of the listing period. And then that's the same as it always was. Never mind, that's not it. I think it's 5. Here we go, 5A. This is the part, concessions, explanations. So here's a big point. We keep saying, because we're used to saying commissions, we need to get that when we're talking to a buyer's agent, we need to get that word out of our head. We need to say concessions, because to Daniel's point, the entire thing that is going to come down to no matter what we said in conversations, it's going to come down to how they wrote their offer, because the buyer's agent cannot receive more than what they wrote in the offer that they asked for. So what we would have to do is, if the seller said, yeah, I'd be willing to give, up to 3% concessions to the buyer's agent to offset their fee, because, and they drove this home on mine, concessions are not they're not a fixed, there's a better word for it. Let's see here. Concessions are not binding. They're simply a willingness to consider, and then only binding if the document is documented in a fully exit purchase agreement. So that's kind of, we need to be real careful of our phrasing. When a buyer's agent calls us and the seller has directed us in writing, and we'll figure out what form we want to use after I talk to the attorney. And then I'm also going to call C.A.R Legal too, just to see what they have to say. But so let's say they told us they pay up to 3%, then we need to use kind of the same language, but we need to say up to 3% concession to offset your buyer's commission. Use the word concession, because that will help alleviate that we said, 3% to one person and somebody else to the other. If they didn't write it in there, if they were at 1.5%, we said two things. We said up to, and we said concession. We didn't say commission. So does that help a little bit?
I think for me, it still doesn't make sense to have anything in writing with the seller anymore, as far as how much they're willing to pay. Because I think, I think it really depends on the offer that they get, and they're gonna want to.
Yes, and maybe I was interpreting that a little bit differently, but you know, we could tell buyers brokers, you know, yes, my seller has indicated that they are willing to offer concessions. Let's just talk about this here. So part 5, seller concessions. So this part explains that they're not a promise to pay anything. They're just sort of a willingness. And then part 2, seller authorizes. So the boilerplate is seller does not authorize broker to put in the MLS. The seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions. Or part 2, if you check this, then the seller authorizes broker to put in the MLS that the seller is willing to offer to consider offers asking for concessions if allowed under the MLS. Even if permitted by the MLS, no amount of the possible concession will be stated in the MLS, either as percent or purchase price, unless seller notifies broker in writing of the amount. But again, this form is strictly for the MLS, what we're doing on the MLS, and then each MLS may or may not have a concessions field anyway. And some of them, they said, may have a concessions field, and then they may have further fields. It looks like, according to the feedback of SDMLS, they're not going to have a field they're not going to have any field different than what they had before. That it'll just be, concessions will just be documented after the sale. Is that the way you understood it too, Daniel?
Yeah, if you log into MLS, there's a memo from the CEO of SDMLS, which was dated, I think, May 28th. And they were saying at the current time, they do not plan to put the seller concessions field in. So this would be a brand new field. It's right now we do have a concessions field once the property closes, which is just like a text box. 2 fields really. One is saying yes or no, I think, if there were concessions, and then the second one is you can put the dollar amount, you can explain why. And most people use that to say, you know, $1,500 concession in lieu of repairs or whatever it may be. So this would be potentially a new field where there would be a seller concessions probably box saying yes, the seller is willing to offer concessions, and that would be on the MLS just as like an indicator that they're willing to do something. Right now, our MLS is not planning to do that, but they said, I think within 60 days, they're going to look to review that. So it's possible it could come at some point. But this is the form I was talking about, and almost all of this form is really just taken from the previous listing agreement. And in the class I watched, they're saying they broke it out because the MLS is no longer it's a marketing tool, but it's no longer a cooperating compensation tool. So they totally took out everything from the MLS in the listing agreement. But you know, if you look at this paragraph 5B, it's talking about authorizing to put in the MLS. And if our MLS doesn't allow that, then you could still, you know, check that box, but you can't really do anything with MLS on it. So it'll be interesting to see what SDMLS does on that. But going back to, yeah, Marilyn.
I have a question because now I'm getting confused, more confused. Did you just say, or did Troy just say that the concession will be a document that's completed after the close of the sale?
Well, so right now in our MLS, when you close escrow, when you mark the property as sold, it asks
and
you
concessions, yeah.
Yeah, it'll ask you, you know, what the price is sold and everything, and the date of closing. And then one of the fields is if there's concessions, and typically that's been used for just, like I said, for like, you know, if there's a request for repair and they just agreed to a credit. So that field will still be there. But this is talking about the potential for a brand new field that would be for the marketing of the property, to say the seller is willing to offer some sort of concession.
Yeah, I understand that part. Yeah. where we in the past have listed concessions for repairs, blah, blah, blah. Then we will also list their, I don't know if we want to say it as an additional compensation or additional concession or however it's supposed to be worded. That's where we'll put in what used to be the commission for the buyer's agent.
We're not
I
sure,
would think
Nolan.
so.
It's going to
Yeah,
depend
it's
on
not clear.
the MLS. It'll depend on the rules of the MLS. So let's say the seller ended up paying 2% to the buyer's broker. We may or may not find out from the MLS that we're supposed to, like, let's say they were supposed to pay 2%. They ended up paying the buyer directly 2%, the buyer's agent directly 2%, and then they did $5,000 credit. Chances are, it could either go two ways. It's that we're supposed to put the 5% plus the amount that was paid to the buyer's agent, but we're not entirely sure. No one has told us whether we're also supposed to document that the seller paid the buyer's agent yet. So there may not, and Daniel's brought this up with me several times in the conversation, there may not be a way for an appraiser to know whether property A, that sold paid a commission or property B didn't. So it's kind of unclear at this point. And it's going to be up to the individual MLSs at this point. So we'll have to follow up with you on that. And then one thing too is if our MLS doesn't hold a field to say up front for the seller's offering concessions, then we don't want to check this box no matter what, because this is strictly saying we're going to do that on the MLS, and if we have no ability to do it, don't check that box. So for now, at least with SDMLS, we wouldn't check that box. And again, Daniel said they'll probably relook at this in 60 days. Back to Kristen's original point though, is what do we tell buyers agents? So most likely the conversation would go that yes, the seller has willing that they're indicated to give some concession for your buyer's agent to offset your buyer's agent commission. So go ahead and write in the offer what it is, and it'll depend on the overall offer terms. In that scenario, we haven't promised them anything. There's no need to document anything extra, right? Other than a conversation that we had to the seller. But if we're specifically saying up to X%, then for our sake, we want to if the seller is directing us that they want us to say that to them, if they want us to say that out to buyer's agents, then we need protection that we were authorized to say that amount. Does that help a little bit?
I think it also kind of goes back to like, what is the market and what is the specifics of your listing and the interest in your listing. So if you have listing and you get one offer, you have to kind of figure out how to make that offer work, right? So, but if you have 10 offers coming in, maybe the seller wants you to tell all the buyer's agents, I will offer this much compensation, commission, concessions. And if that's the case, then maybe you should have it in writing. But if it's just sort of a conversation you have, then it goes back to being careful what you say to the buyer's agents. So the way C.A.R is set up these forms, you don't need to have it in writing what the seller is willing to offer. But obviously you should have a conversation with them about it.
I think I'm going to go back to Kristen's point. If we don't have anything in writing, then I think our liability is wide open, because the seller could come back and say, well, I never really told you that amount. And if I don't have anything in writing, how do I defend myself? Or do I just document it through my own notes?
Well, Marilyn, I want us to have it in writing. What C.A.R was saying is they don't support, their forms aren't supporting having a specific amount predetermined. That's what C.A.R is saying. But I'm saying if we're going to be quoting a specific amount, I want us to have it documented.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because we can't just throw out numbers without having, we can't quote prices, anything without having it documented. So we need to have it documented.
Okay, so what form are we documenting it on?
Yeah. Well, so that's the open question, because I just found out on Thursday that C.A.R is not supporting this. And so I'm going to call our real estate attorney and then also call legal. So I don't know yet what form or what process we're going to do. They literally just took this away in the last couple weeks. So, because remember, the first version had a place for it in the listing agreement. Now they don't. And then I had taken a class 2 weeks ago, and they didn't answer the question of what do you do if the seller wants you to. They just avoided it completely. It wasn't till Thursday when the lady actually said, we don't support that. We have no form to support that. Well, so they didn't say use the modification of terms. They didn't say use an addendum to the, they didn't say. So I don't know for sure what we're supposed to do until I get a little more clarity. But in the, at the current point, if you have a listing, don't go quoting a specific amount until we have documented in writing one way or the other, and I'll find out from the attorneys and I'll get back to everybody. I'm sure it'll be a very simple thing to do. And it'll probably be an addendum to the residential listing agreement. But C.A.R has taken publicly, it seems like, taken their name off contracts for that reason, because they don't want the liability, which does give us more liability if we start quoting, if we start negotiating buyer's commissions or concessions up front.
And just to bring it back, because I like, for all of us, I think when we look at all these forms and the changes, and you have to check this box, you have to check that box, where do we going to document this? It gets very confusing. So I think going back to like real life practice, how will we do this? So currently, well, not anymore, but up to these points, these forms change. We had a listing. We determined with the seller upfront that we're going to have this percentage for the seller side, this percentage for the buyer side. Then we have offers coming in. We don't talk about commission at that point with the seller because it's already been talked about. We don't talk about commission with the buyer's agent because it's on the MLS. Then we get into escrow. Escrow instructions come out. Commission instructions come out. It's the dollar amount. So that's already been determined about the commission. At this point now, you're only talking with the seller in writing about getting your listing fee. You have a conversation with the seller about, the fact that buyer's agents are expecting to be paid somehow. There's a form for that, the BCA. And then the actual agreed amount that's going to be paid is going to be agreed to during the purchase agreement negotiations. So it's in terms of, the fear of, oh, well, the seller says, I didn't approve that amount. They will approve that amount in writing in the purchase agreement negotiations. So it's a different way of doing it. And I think that's what we have to kind of get our heads around.
Yeah, I think this could be described as a hot mess.
It's a big change, Marilyn, and I've had 10 days to kind of wrap my head around it. But I started to do something the week before, but then they didn't answer, a third of my questions until last week, so I didn't want to confuse you guys more. But yeah, they basically are, it's a big change. I think it'll be helpful if we go through the buyer representation agreement, and I'll let Daniel do that. Just a couple quick points. Again, offers of concession are not binding. They are simply a willingness to consider. We've got to train ourselves. I know I've misstated it a couple times. I keep saying commission. Just train ourselves to say concessions anytime we're dealing with a buyer. So that's one thing. Again, their goal was to split up, bifurcate, separate commissions, negotiations completely. that was their goal. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then we'll let Daniel go through the buyer representation agreement. I think that will be helpful in terms of wrapping our heads around how does it get documented what the buyer's agent is going to get paid.
Troy, do you have the buyer rep? Can you
Yes.
share it?
Oh.
I have my notes on my phone, so if I can look,
Sure.
I can that way.
I have it right here.
Yeah, I'm just gonna scroll.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
So this form, since the last time we looked at it with the updates, I don't think it's changed a whole lot since then. But so the key things to talk about are, actually I can. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. So one thing here is in this top part, I don't know if you can see that little, I make a little annotation. So
Yeah, we can see it.
Let's get rid of that. Okay, so the first part is it's a maximum of 3 months, which is super annoying to me, but that's the way it is. So if you take a list, a buyer's representation agreement, you can only do it up for 3 months. At the end of that 3 months, you can extend it. There's a modification of terms form specifically for this form. So now we have 2 different modification terms. One's for the listing side, one's for the buyer side, which I actually think is a good change. So if it's towards the end of 3 months, if things are going well, there's a form, you can extend it, but you cannot have it longer than 3 months at one time. And that's going back to, there is an assembly bill that's going through that's probably going to be, I think, Troy, do you remember when it was? January?
It would be effective January 1st, they said, and they said it's getting no opposition, so they think it's going to steamroll through the state approval process. It's not actually ratified yet, though.
Yeah, so it's in the works. It's gone through several different, all the process they have to go through to actually make a legislation happen. It's getting close to happening, and so it will do several things. One of the good things, though, is that in the state of California, it will require an agent, and that's not just realtors, it's non-realtors too. So if there's some company out there that's not technically realtors, it's requiring agents that are representing buyers, they have to have a written buyer representation agreement. So that's actually, I think, a really good thing, because it's, it may be a little different for buyers when you're first talking to them, but I think probably pretty quickly buyers will become very accustomed to knowing that this is just part of the deal. And if,
Hey, quick question.
Yeah.
I hate the 3 months, first of all, but
yeah,
on that note, is there anywhere included, like if they bought something after the 3 months, that we showed them during the 3 months, that protects us so that we can still be compensated?
Yes, just like the listing agreement has that continuation period, it's down here.
Okay, and there's no maximum for that, right?
Troy, can you scroll a little bit up further?
Higher?
All right, scroll down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Just so, yeah, it was blocking it. So it's the continuation period shall be blank calendar days. So there's nothing that's been saying that I've seen that said
Yeah, because I would just do
maximum.
a year or something there, just to make
Yeah.
sure.
My guess,
Just in case, they get tired after 3 months, they don't want to sign another one. They say they're taking a break, and then they're like, well, that one we looked at,
Right.
Yeah,
is still on the market or it came back on the market, you know, like
right.
I just don't like that.
Troy,
That's so dumb why
can
they
you
would
can you scroll down to paragraph 4C? Because I just want to see if I can't remember if there's anything in that that says
4C.
yeah. So here's that paragraph that's talking about that. So brokers shall be entitled to compensation provided, paragraph 2E, so however many calendar days you put. Buyer interested into the agreement to acquire property for which the broker is involved. Broker's right to compensation pursuant to this paragraph shall not only apply if prior expiration of this agreement. So you have to give a written notice. So you do need to have a period of time in there. And then you need, if they're not going to sign another agreement with you, you do need to fill out that in BIP form to list the properties that you showed them, so that you have proof to say, just so you know, these are the properties that we showed you, so that they can't go into.
This is so annoying.
Yeah.
It is annoying, Kristen. It's really annoying, especially the 3-month thing. But in terms of this maximum number of days, I will ask the car attorneys. My guess is that it probably wouldn't be enforceable if it's longer
more than a year.
Well, I would say probably longer. See, if this is 3 months, if the entire agreement was 3 months, my guess is they're going to say the maximum this could be is 90 days.
90
That's
days.
my guess. I don't know for sure. No one.
I don't like
Yeah.
that.
They
So
should
I'm
put
gonna.
that in writing.
Yeah, I'll ask Kristen and see what
Okay.
their advice is. That's a great question. I have a list of questions here for the car attorney. But yeah, the 30 days is ridiculous. They've never worked with the buyer other than watching TV shows where they show 3 properties and the buyer magically buys one.
The other thing, this is not new since the last time we talked, but just to point out this box right here, you want to make sure you check that box because paragraph, because by default, this representation agreement is non-exclusive, meaning the buyer could sign this with multiple people. So you absolutely want to check that box to say it's exclusive, because otherwise you could be wasting your time. The next part, I don't think they've really changed that since the last time we saw. Basically, you want to check the boxes that you think that they're going to be interested in, and then I wouldn't get like Troy has it filled out here, location, county, San Diego. I wouldn't get so specific to say, city, La Mesa, because what if they go to Del Cerro? But that's there for you.
One thing I wanted to add to, Daniel, is the reason I checked multifamily is because this says, the boilerplate says single family residence, and there's so many ADUs coming out now, and there's going to be even more. What if your buyer tells you they just want a house, but they end up buying a house with an ADU? Well, technically that's 2 units, right? 2 to 4
Good
units.
point.
So I would always check multifamily just in case that's what they end up buying.
And as you can see, the language they have here, they have boxes for counties or cities. It needs to be specific enough that you're not saying like in the state of California, because that's a little too broad. But saying in the county of San Diego is totally fine. You could do cities, but I personally would not do cities. I'd probably stick it to counties. And if for some reason you have someone who's right on the border, maybe you want to do, if they're up in like way North County, maybe you want to do Orange County too. But I would not be so broad to say it's like all of California. There is a separate form that you could do. I think we had this form before. It's called the BIP. They may have had something similar. This is one of those forms that, to me, even before this all changed, I never really saw the point in it, because it's asking like, what do you want in a property? Do you want a yard? Do you want and I just don't really see the point of that, but that's there for you. Let's see, keep going.
Let me go down.
Yeah, I'm trying to see. I'm scrolling through my notes here. Okay, so 2E, that's the big part, compensation. So this is where you would, and you can see, if you remember from the listing agreement, it's got this big block here saying broker compensation is not, set, et cetera, et cetera. And then it is referencing the BCA form. So the BCA form is a new form. I think we looked at that before, and it is tied to both the listing agreement and the buyer representation agreement. So if you pull up those forms, you're going to have that form. So it's a talking point to go over with them. And so obviously, just like a listing agreement, you're going to put your percentage amount right here, or dollar amount if you wanted to do that instead. And then it's saying right here, so if broker received compensation from seller or others, the representation to the buyer, the amount shall be credited against buyer's obligation to pay broker. Broker shall not receive any amount in excess of 2E. So a couple of things there. That's a good talking point. So, if you're having this conversation with them, you're saying, you need to pay me 2.5%. You can very quickly explain, this is how it would be offset, and we would, work to do that. And the other key thing too is, if you had 2.5% in here, and then you called the listing agent and said, trying to write an offer, and they have to say, oh, well, they're willing to pay 3%. You cannot get that extra 0.5% unless you then go back to your buyer and create a modification of terms for this representation agreement. So that's different than the way it used to be. So something to keep in mind. Cancellation, that was what we talked about that before. I don't think we need to go over that. I think you can scroll out paragraph 9. Oh no. So yeah, you can see the BCA, that's by default here.
Where do you want me to go?
I think go down to, I think we had paragraph 9 is the next.
Paragraph 9, okay.
Yeah. Actually, maybe it was in the grid, sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Oh yeah. It's paragraph 9B is the actual written part about it.
Mm-hmm.
So this was confusing because Troy got one piece of information, I got a different piece of information, but from 2 different classes. So this, by default, it says time to deliver buyer's personal financial information. So within 5 calendar, or you can fill it in, calendar days from the execution of this agreement, the buyer is supposed to give the personal financial information. This is a little, I think, unclear because it's saying this BFPI form. And Troy was told in a class that it's not really a required form. I think it's a horrible form because it's really asking like all sorts of things about, do you have gift funds? Do you have, basically, can you afford to pay me? And I just think a lot of this form is really what a lender should be dealing with. But the key point here is there is this box, buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. So if you're having this conversation, and like we can see in California, at least San Diego, most people barely have enough for down payment, let alone an additional amount to just pay outright for their buyer's agent. So now I think, Troy, if you go to 9B, paragraph 9B.
Okay. Before we leave that, basically, if that box is checked, then, they were telling us up front that they couldn't pay out of pocket, is what that means. But they still have the ability to ask for your compensation through the offer. There you go.
Yeah.
90.
So
That second checkbox option is saying like I'm assuming they mean like a loan product.
Right.
Do we
right.
have
Yeah.
an example? Do we have an example of one that would not allow
So
compensate?
so I think they did that because they knew VA didn't allow that, but VA is temporarily, probably indefinitely. They'll probably do a more long-term thing. But for the
Right.
time
Okay.
being, yeah.
So
So
there's no actual example that we know of right now that would apply.
you'd want to talk to their lender probably just to make sure. And one
Mhm.
thing they'll probably get into in a minute here, when you're writing the offer, you know, there used to be a concessions field, like if the buyer needs some sort of closing costs, you know, credit. There's that, and there's also the SBPP, whatever. So you actually want to break out in your offer the compensation and the regular concessions, because what we're hearing as far as what C.A.R is saying in the lending industry is that if the seller is paying a concession towards the buyer's agent's commission, that does not have a maximum, whereas a concession for other things does. So it sounds like the lending industry is probably understanding that they need to evolve on all this. But I think that the short answer is just check with the buyer's lender to see if there's anything, because maybe there could be still. And then Troy, if you go back to paragraph 9b. So this is tied back to that box. If they check the box saying they don't have sufficient funds to pay, the nice thing they did was, if those boxes are checked right here, it's saying, sorry, if either box is checked for any property for which buyer writes an offer, buyer agrees to include a term in buyer's offer requesting seller to compensate buyer's broker, et cetera, et cetera. So basically what it's saying is there's no box to check here. If they check that box saying they don't have funds to pay you, then they're authorizing you automatically to negotiate that in the purchase agreement. So I thought that's a good thing. It's a default. It's not like a question of whether or not that's going to happen. Then I think the next thing, Troy, paragraph 16.
Yep.
So paragraph 16, you can see right here, it has 2.5%. When you're filling out the top part where you're saying how much commission you're agreeing to, this should pre-populate is what we're being told, but just double check when you're filling out this form. And all it's saying is just basically saying, it's restating it. And the reason they said this is because if you are writing an offer and you are asking the seller to pay on behalf of the buyer, you know, concession for the compensation, then the seller has a right to actually ask for some sort of proof that you have a written agreement for that amount. So the reason they did this separate is you could actually just give them this last page of the document. You don't need to give them the whole buyer representation agreement, which I think is good, because if, you know, that way it doesn't, if there's other things higher up that you want to have or not have, you know, publicly to the seller, you don't have to. You can just give them this last page.
And
I think that was the only notes I had, Troy.
One interesting thing is it did, when I did this form, it did auto-populate, but it looks like it didn't check the box. So that's one interesting little glitch. And then also just pointing out that when we have an exclusive representation, there's another spot for the buyer to initial here. That would be easy to miss when we're getting a buyer broker agreement signed. Daniel, can you pull up, I think it might be good to just quickly do the RPA just to show them again that spot where in the offer.
Yeah, I don't have I'm on my iPad, so I don't have the document.
Oh, okay. All right. No worries. I don't think I saved it. Let me look. Maybe I did. No, I didn't save it. Okay. Give me one quick second. Oh, for Pete's sakes. I don't know why. Anyway, well, that's, I don't want to waste everybody's time. Oops, Marilyn dropped out. But basically the gist of it is you would, oh no. There you are. Let's stop sharing. There we go. I see a ceiling fan. So basically you would, no matter what, whether you're receiving an offer from on the seller's behalf or on the buyer's behalf, if there's a commission that's going to be paid, it'll be all negotiated through the offer every single time. That's going to be the only way that it's done. And so that's going to be, quite a bit of difference than what we're used to.
Troy, I have a quick question about the BRBC.
Sure.
I just wanted to know when most people are getting that signed. Is it before you're taking the buyer for the first time to go see a property, or is it after the first showing so that they kind of get to know you better and then you send it? Like, I'm only asking because, again, we lost a buyer because they were so offended that I was trying to get a BRBC signed. I just don't know if that's shifted, or somebody who's still a first-time buyer and is not familiar with how this goes, when are they gonna, be comfortable seeing this document?
Right. So the quick answer is, in order to get paid, the NAR settlement says that we have to have the BRBC signed prior to showing, not prior to writing the offer, prior to showing that specific property where you expect to get paid. So that pulls it really far forward. The only silver lining is that if that state legislation passes, then any real estate agent, not realtor, any real estate agent licensed in California that represents a buyer and expects to get paid, they have to follow those same, they have to have it signed as well. So in other words, the buyer's hesitancy that we had before was because they didn't know us or whatever, that can still be there, but they can't then go down the road to some different agent and have them show them a bunch of properties and expect to get paid either without a buyer representation agreement signed. So everywhere that buyer turned, they're going to be getting told the same thing. I have to have this agreement signed in order to show you these properties. And you could do a BRBC and just make it just for the 3 places you were showing that day if you wanted to.
Right.
But the settlement rule is prior to showing.
Okay, so in other words,
Okay,
it's just
what's the date for that again? You said August something?
So C.A.R. MLS, the field is going to go away August 5th and August 12th, but you might as well have them might as well follow it now, or basically so you might as well start getting the BRBC signed right now, anytime you
Yeah.
show, because chances are you're gonna write the offer before August the 17th is the NAR deadline, which is when the BRBC part would be enforced.
Sorry
And
to
just-
interrupt you, Brian.
Oh, that's okay.
Just to clarify, we don't actually know what C.A.R. MLS is doing. So Connect MLS, we have in San Diego at SDAR, we have Connect MLS and Paragon, which both are the same tools or different tools to get to the MLS. So, which is confusing. But so Connect MLS, which I don't think most people here have used, maybe Troy and Brian did.
Once.
Yeah. Connect MLS is August 5th. Paragon is August 12th, but we don't know what C.A.R. MLS is doing, but it should all be around the same time. Troy, I pulled up the RPA. If you want to.
Oh, perfect.
I have
Yeah,
one quick thing. I have one
Sure.
quick thing to offer that I was just thinking about
yes.
is, you know, the BRBC is going to expire every 3 months. Well, that's also when their pre-approval expires. So if you sign it around the time they get their pre-approval, then the conversation can kind of just go together, you know, like,
That's helpful, Kristen.
That's a good idea.
it's
Yeah.
just to
Mhm,
kind of, you know, you can kind of just group those together and
mhm.
just keep them both fresh all at the same time, since they're going to expire around the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
I think to that point too, I think Daniel and I were talking last Friday. Maybe one of the silver linings of this whole change, it's just going to be hard for buyers, but I think at some point buyers are just going to need to be more prepared up front, right? When they're just going to need to get some of their financial ducks in a row and things like that. And so, you know, maybe we'll just have better prepared buyers at some point down the road.
So can you see the RPA on the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this hasn't really changed very much, but so what we were talking about before, there's the seller credit, if any, to buyer paragraph in this grid here in G1. So that's basically like a regular concessions field. So we had that before. That would be like, you know, if for some reason they wanted something to help with their closing costs, that's regular concessions. And then the separate thing is in G3 here, seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. So if you check this, it'll automatically populate that SPBB form. And in the class I watched, and I think Troy probably heard it too, you know, there's nothing stopping you if you wanted to say up front, like a certain dollar amount or percentage, you could put that all in this G1 field. But it's probably a lot better to separate those if for any reason there were more than one, and to specifically say that this is compensation related to compensation, because like I was saying, the lending industry is basically saying that would not count towards the max, whereas this other field would. So that's what we're talking about. And then going to Brian's question about showing property, we have the BRBC, which we just looked at. There's this other form, which we may or may not use. Hold on here. Okay. So this is what, in the class sites I took, they called this the BRBC Lite. So it's like a little baby BRBC. So this is a 3-page document. And if you had a client that, you know, you're just working with, you're not sure how committed they are, maybe they're a little uneasy to sign a 3-month commitment, this is an agreement. It cannot go more than 30 days. So it's called a PSRA, Property Showing and Representation Agreement. So it can only go up to 30 days, and it doesn't have to be 30 days, it can be less than that. And then it's for, it's basically the same thing, but you only have 3 properties here, which is funny because like we're saying, it seems like they watch HGTV and we show them 3 properties and they buy one of them. But this one is only for 3 properties. So if you wanted to do something where you felt like they're a little uneasy, or maybe you're a little uneasy to sign a bigger commitment with them, you could use this form. And it does the same things. It's talking about, you know, compensation, timing, et cetera, and then you could turn it into a BRBC. It's, you know, create a new form later if you wanted to. So that is available if someone needed to.
It could be handy if you were, on a weekend and some, buyer calls you that you didn't even know was, and says, hey, can you go show me this property, quickly. You could do that form, specifically for that property, and it's not the full 5-page BRBC, but it still would allow you to get paid for that one. So it's kind of nice to have as a substitute, but it's definitely limited. It's only non-exclusive. It's only 30 days, and it's only for a max of 3 properties. So it wouldn't be your go-to form for sure.
That sounds like a good form for like an investor or something. Like if you had an
Yes.
investor that wanted to see a couple things or something.
It's kind of a nice
'Cause they're not,
alternative.
yeah,
But
they're
you
not going to
say-
commit to you anyway exclusively.
Right.
Okay, yeah, that's Kristen. That's what I was just gonna say. So it's non-exclusive, meaning they could sign that with several other agents
Yep.
if they're trying to figure out who they want to work with. Okay.
It's strictly
So
allowed.
only the properties that you're showing them would be the ones that you would be compensated.
Well,
if they
not
ended up
even
buying.
that. Not even that necessarily, because it's not exclusive. If they chose to write with a different agent, they could, if that
Oh,
agent
got it.
also
Okay.
showed them. But it does preserve your ability to get paid because you can prove you showed it. You signed it before you showed it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, buyers have a lot of leeway to jump ship. Yes. But so that, it's big changes, it's all that, but it's statewide. It's going to be, all buyers are going to be impacted the same. There's going to be a big learning curve. There's going to be more changes that come, I'm sure. One thing we know is real estate agents, we've been through a lot. We're adaptable. We'll figure it out. And there's a reason why, we provide a really good service. Customers need us, clients need us. So we'll figure it out. I don't love all these changes. I would just love to stay the way we've done it historically, but clearly that ship has sailed. So we're gonna just have to adapt quickly and see how it goes. But we can all learn from each other too. So if anybody has any little anecdote of, oh, hey, I had this happen or that happen, let's learn from each other. I think that'll be a really good way to get ahead of the curve. And who knows, it could provide some really good opportunities that we haven't even thought of yet. Maybe it in some ways will be easier if buyers just know that they're going to sign an agreement. Maybe that's actually a good thing down the road. If we're just negotiating the seller commission with the seller, that's a lot easier. So anyway,
I really like the buyer rep agreement and locking them in, and if there was any hesitation to do it before showing a property. What you
Right.
said before, somebody said it was every buyer has to do this.
Yes.
I can't show you properties without this. I really like that. It locks them in. We've all had buyers that flew the coop, and
Yes.
this could prevent that.
Well, and then too, like I don't really love talking about commission, but I was kind of surprised in a good way with those clients you know, we're backed into a corner. I had that 0% listing, you know, offered that they wanted to see. And so in a way it forces us to say, you know, you know, I expect to get paid. And they were, you know, they were fine with that. They understood that, you know, so I think it's, we may, you know, there's going to be parts of this that we may enjoy more than we think. Anybody else have any other thoughts?
I think
All
just talking about just real life practice. I think, you know, when you're talking with a seller, you want to obviously, I think it'll be a lot easier to say this is my fee, and then negotiate that. Obviously, have a conversation with them. Maybe they don't want to decide right up front how much they want to offer to the buyer's agent. And then when you're having a conversation as a seller's agent with the buyer's agent, you want to make sure you're very careful about what you are saying. One thing Brian and I have used for sometimes like offer comparisons with our clients is we have a spreadsheet. It's very, very simple. And it just says, you know, column 1 is offer 1, column 2 is offer 2. And we just have the basic terms. And then, you know, because it's very likely we'll start seeing more on the seller side where we get offers coming in that there's different commission amounts. And so helping the seller to kind of see the bottom line of like, what does this mean? What does that mean? And we didn't really talk about it, but you know, in one of the classes I took, the seller can counter back that commission amount. So you have to have them kind of help them see like what is the bottom line for them, because just because the commission is higher or lower in one or the other doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the best offer. So I think, you know, coming up with little tools like that to help our sellers is a good thing.
Yeah, that was a good point, Daniel. And I actually have 3 pages of notes that I'll email everybody, and they just have it broken down. There's actually also an open house non-agency agreement thing. Essentially, it's not required. You don't have to have people sign that if you don't want to. That's why I didn't necessarily go over it today. But you know, when the seller is lining up offers, they can counter, like Daniel said, they can counter the commission, or yeah, the request for buyer commission. So they can counter at a higher price. They could counter it saying they, you know, want to pay 0 or some lesser number than asked. And then one of the people said, well, if the seller counters, if you know, if your BRBC is for 3% and the seller says they'll pay 2 after, you know, during offer negotiations, technically the buyer would owe the difference, unless they have checked the box to already tell you that they don't have enough to pay it. And in that scenario, then you don't have to represent that buyer, or you could agree to lower your BRBC amount to match the 2%. So there's ways that it'll play out, but we'll end up to some extent negotiating sometimes commissions through the offer, which I think is what, you know, is what the DOJ and other things wanted. I think they wanted that whole thing to be sort of front and center with the parties. One thing I had thought of over the weekend too, which is kind of tangential, but maybe one of the good things about, because I at first I can't stand that 90 days for the limit on a buyer representation agreement. It seems like the minimum should be 6 months, but maybe one of the reasons they did that is that, you know, like all these huge websites like Zillow or even Realtor.com, for Christ's sakes, or, you know, these huge mega platforms, they probably will, you know, like you can click a box to say, show me this property now. Well, that box on their website may actually pop up a buyer representation agreement that the client is signing before they show the property, right? And so maybe it will help prevent these sort of meat market online companies from locking in a buyer for a year or 6 months, and then maybe after they have that experience where they don't get personalized service, they could come back to an agent who's really dedicated rather than just someone who's working for or whatever. So maybe that could be a good thing, that that a buyer doesn't accidentally sign up online for this long buyer representation period.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'm also just trying to think about like actually like what Daniel keeps referring to, like like how we actually do this in real life, right?
Yes.
And
right.
I'm like, because like, I'm thinking about, my compensation, like if I'm representing the buyer, like I want to be fair, but I also don't want to pigeonhole myself if a seller's, offering more than what,
Right.
I maybe originally. So I'm just like, I'm trying to think how, like the best way to navigate that without, still getting paid the most that you can, right? Like,
Yeah.
Right.
of
I
course
think
we want to get paid the most.
for
Mhm.
me, I mean, I'm not saying I'm going to go into every situation like this, but for me, if I was talking with a buyer, I would not want my percentage to be so low that I'm like Kristen just saying, I would be like shoot myself in the foot because maybe there's someone else out there, the seller's willing to offer me more. But if I would get into the habit of having a conversation where if you are talking about the commission amount, you automatically go right into how is that paid? Because when the buyer is hearing like, oh, I have to pay this amount, that's like a fear factor for them. So going into this is how it will play out. We will ask the seller side for it. In most cases, that will probably work out just fine. If for some reason it doesn't, we will have a conversation about that and kind of hint that, it's up to you, but it would hint that maybe you'd reduce this amount to make it work. That's kind of how I would do it, just to partner that conversation of the actual percentage amount with how is it going to be paid, and here's how we'll work through that kind of thing. I don't know, and it's gonna be trial by error too, and it's also dependent on the person.
Right. I also think when you're working with the buyer to sign the BRBC, I think it will give them comfort in that one paragraph we talked about down low, where so you could say, my value or my worth or whatever is 2.5% or 3 or whatever you want it to be, so that you're not just shooting yourself in the foot from the very beginning. But then also show them that box that says, the buyer, I don't have the money to cover this, so that's your way of telling the buyer, you're notifying me up front that this, that if you buy a home, that by signing this agreement, it's not coming out of your pocket, but we would have to negotiate it through the purchase agreement. So I think that can give them comfort too, that it's like, oh, okay, there's a path for you to get this 2.5% or whatever. It's very structured, if that makes sense.
And I think also you can go into like, we're not attorneys, but a contract does need to have specific things. It needs to have, parties with agreements between. It needs to have a time. It can't just be open-ended forever. And it needs to have some sort of compensation. So you can't have a agreement. You can say to your buyer, this is an agreement between us that we're working. We have to have something in here. So we have this percentage amount. I understand you don't have the funds. This is how we'll try to work to make that happen. But you can't, that's the reason why there's a percentage amount in there, because it is an agreement between the two parties, that someone's going to do something for the other person, and that person's going to pay that person for that. So,
and at some point we'll be able to say the state requires it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I'm just curious, has anybody seen any like loan products that actually take into consideration paying the buyer's agent and actually go through? Is that a thing yet, or?
Not yet, although raising the purchase price would effectively do that.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, but to your point, Brian, I bet you there are some lenders who come out with some very creative things, depending on the market we're in, whether it's a seller's market or a buyer's market or whatever.
Right.
But right now, lenders
And
are
it's
limited because
still,
rates are so high.
it still remains to be seen how this is gonna affect appraisal values as
Yeah,
well.
that's
Yes,
been the
That's
most
gonna be
frustrating
big.
thing to me. No one talked about that in any of the classes or things I've seen.
right.
And that's such a huge thing, because it's like, okay, yeah, you give us permission, the lenders have permission to pay the concession, right? Quote unquote. But yet, we have to raise the purchase price, but it doesn't appraise for that much. Then
Right.
it's like,
Right. Yeah.
okay, so we're just back to square one then. Like,
Hmm.
yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But one last good thing about us is, to me, it seems like this would be a horrible time to be a real estate agent if you relied on cold leads, because that's just going to be it's just going to be a frenzy for on the cold lead side to get somebody to be exclusive to you for any length of time. But I think our whole business models for all of us, like, our clients know us. We're repeat and referral, or we're somehow have affinities or associations with people. And so I think our just general DNA of the way we get clients is in the perfect spot for being able to explain all this and succeed no differently than we have before. It's just going to be different.
Troy, looking ahead, when do
Mhm.
you think there are going to be other updates that you want us to get together to discuss?
Yeah, so I'm going to try and get a hold of the two people, Nick and then also Car Legal, either today or tomorrow. So hopefully, really soon. But as soon as I can get answers to the questions, I'll let everyone know, and then we can regroup. And if you think of any more questions, so I wrote down, the one that Kristen had, that was a good one on the BRBC, what the max is for the
Calendar days.
calendar. Yep. Yep. And then I want to know for sure, because on that financial form, the attorney that I talked to said that that's not required, but it sure looks like the way it's written into the contract, it is required. But anyway, I'm sure they'll say it's not. And then, obviously the big question is, what form do we use to document if the seller wants us to quote a specific amount? And then, oh yeah, one thing too is, I'm not clear on, so let's say that a buyer looks at a house on open house, and then they come to us, and we didn't know that they were out house hunting, right? And we just didn't even know they were looking for property. And then they come to us and they say, oh, we saw this house on open house, last weekend, but we want you to write an offer. And they say they haven't signed anything with the open house person as far as an actual agreement. And so in that instance, is that requirement that we have, and they're willing to sign a buyer representation agreement, but yet they've seen it before we've even, had the opportunity. So in order to get paid, do we have to show them again in person? Or does the whole thing that it needs to be done prior to showing it magically disappear? I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, that seems kind of unclear, but that scenario will happen. So, yeah. More shall be revealed. But if you think of any other questions, let me know, and I'll try and get them answered for us. Are we good? Is that
Good.
Depends on
enough
how many more
information
new
for one day?
forms that depends on how many more new forms they come up
Oh
with
my
in the next
gosh, I
2
know.
weeks.
Yeah.
There's no quizzes.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
It
Yeah.
keeps the attorneys in business. So, as Marilyn says, it's a hot mess. So they have to come up
Yeah.
with different things to keep them busy.
Well,
I've
and
been waiting a long time to use that hot mess thing.
then Yeah.
I like it.
all right. Well,
Thank you, Troy.
yeah,
This has been
thanks.
very informative. Thank you.
Yes, and thanks Daniel too. He's always good as well. And
Thank you, Daniel.
yes.
Thank you, Daniel.
All right, everybody. Well, again, if you learn anything, if you know anything, if you hear anything, let us know. Because these next, I don't know, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, this is going to be you know, a good adaptable learning curve. But I think we'll get through it quickly. And again, we may be pleasantly surprised. Who knows how this thing ends up? But
And the good thing is everyone is going through it.
that's the thing. Yeah. It's like a buyer is not going to be able to purchase a home with an agent without having something signed. So, yeah. All right. Well, have a good rest of your week, and more shall be revealed, as they say.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Everybody.
everyone.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.